Imagine for a moment that you encounter someone for the very first time. Maybe it's a new coworker, a fellow church member, or a couple that's brand new to your neighborhood, and you hit it off. You really hit it off. You discover that you have common interests, common goals, and very similar backgrounds. Now, it's because of that affinity that your new friends invite you and your spouse over for dinner the following weekend. It'll be fun, they promise, and you have every reason to believe that it really will be. But then the weekend comes and the fun doesn't. At first, the directions that they give you to their home doesn't quite get you to their home. Their address doesn't show up on your GPS, and they fail to tell you that they live in a brand new neighborhood. And when you finally do find your way there, you realize that they live in a gated community, and you have to wait several minutes before they respond to you buzzing on the intercom and allow you in. And when you pull up in their driveway, you find it strange that the porch light is dark, they take a long time to come to the door, and their greeting to you is, at best, half-hearted. You discover that dinner is a hastily cooked frozen pizza, and the conversation is one-sided, focused far more on what they want you to know about themselves than what they want to discover about you. And to top it all off, their house is just messy, their kids are rude, and their stinking dog keeps trying to climb up in your lap. Now, hopefully, that is a fictional scenario that you've never experienced. But chances are that illustration serves as a sad analogy of the typical weekend experience in far too many churches. Every single weekend, you have guests who are checking you out for the very first time. Every single weekend, those guests are judging you not just for the quality of the message or the volume of the music, but on the hospitality that they received when they arrived. So the question for all of us is this: are we prepared for guests and eagerly anticipating their arrival, or are we caught off guard if and when they actually show up? The Apostle Paul spoke to this in Colossians chapter 4, where he warned the early church to walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. I believe that the outsiders Paul refers to are not only those people in our community that might not ever come to our church, but those outsiders that are seeking to be insiders by trusting us with their time on a Sunday morning. I think that there are 5 primary principles that should guide how we set up our churches for hospitality on the weekend. And maybe your church excels at 1 or 2 of these, or perhaps you've never thought about them at all. My goal is to help you equip your church to understand that the sermon really does begin in the parking lot. Principle number 1 is that the gospel is offensive, but nothing else should be. The Bible itself says that it is offensive. 1 Corinthians 1:18 says that the word of the cross is folly or foolishness to those who are perishing. But to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. In other words, we can't assume that everyone agrees with or even understands the message that we're presenting. If your pastor or teaching team is presenting the full gospel of Jesus, it is not an "I'm okay, you're okay" message. No, the message is you're a wicked, depraved sinner and you are in need of a gracious, redeeming Savior. But without Him, you're going to spend eternity in hell. Now, that's not necessarily a touchy-feely message. It's definitely not something you could slap on a coffee cup and sell in your local Christian bookstore. And though it's an eternally true statement, it is quite simply offensive to most unbelievers. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that you should soften the offense of the message, but I do believe that you should remove the offense of everything leading up to the message. Unfriendly greeters, unorganized systems, poor signage, and dirty restrooms can and do create an offense that take people's eyes off of the message of the gospel. When we distract people with those things before they ever walk into the auditorium, it's harder to capture them with the beauty of the message that we've been called to preach. Just as God is not glorified by your personal hospitality if you invite someone to your home but ignore them when they arrive, He's not glorified when churches preach a message of grace but fail to generously welcome those who are outsiders. So when we talk about first impressions or guest services within the church, what we're doing is simply taking a biblical virtue of hospitality and we're putting it together at an institutional level. A church's hospitality can adorn the gospel and it can encourage faith. But on the flip side, a cold and unfriendly church actually contradicts the gospel message. The second driving principle of a guest services team is that the why is always more important than the what. All of us have type A people on our teams that want a 62-point job description that sets them up for every scenario that could go wrong and question, or even a question that a first-time guest could bring. And while job descriptions are important, I mean, we have job descriptions for all of our volunteer roles, focusing on what you are doing will often cause you to lose sight of why you're doing it. A volunteer greeter could be meticulous and precise in the way that they open a door and speak a greeting to a guest. But if they fail to realize they are serving because of the gospel, they have failed to really serve that guest. A parking team member could efficiently fill up every single space in a crowded lot. But if he does so with a dictatorial attitude, he's failed to love and serve the driver of that car as Christ would. We serve our guests and our longtime members as a reflection of the generosity of Christ. As Jesus has served us, we're to serve others. The generosity of Jesus dictates that we treat and serve our guests well. No job description can bring about that change of heart. The change of heart comes when a volunteer realizes that they have been loved well, so they must also love well. Now, obviously, I'm not against job descriptions for volunteers or systems and processes to make the weekend run smoothly. We use all of those things here, and they're all important, but we have to create systems that give our teams a baseline of service and then releases them to live in the moment so that they can respond to individuals, not to a policy. Principle number 3 is that everything speaks. One of those details is found in the language that you use. You may have noticed that we call folks guests and not that dreaded V word, visitor. The difference is subtle, but it's significant. Guests are people that we've prepared for. We're glad when they arrive and we hate to see them go. Visitors are those who show up unexpectedly and they throw us outside of the realm of our precious routines. There are other details that will distract as well. Room temperature, ambient lighting, inside jokes from the stage, confusing theological terms that are left unexplained. Whatever it is, we have to think through the entire weekend experience from the perspective of an outsider. We have to figure out what we want our guests to talk about after they leave and work backwards from there to make that happen. Now, this is not about catering to people's creature comforts. It's simply about eliminating all other unnecessary distractions so that the gospel becomes the forefront. Principle 4 is that we should seek to make outsiders insiders. What can we do from the very first moment a guest drives onto our campus? We'll break this down in other videos, but in short, we need to give guests easy, achievable, understandable next steps. We don't want to overwhelm them with information that they don't need right then. We don't want to unnerve them by attacking them with overzealous kindness. And we don't want to ignore them completely, leaving them wondering exactly what their next step should be. No, we should strike an appropriate balance. We want the transition from the highway to the parking lot to the lobby to the auditorium to be as seamless and stress-free as we can possibly make it. We want to have systems in place where a first-timer can easily move from one element to the next, receiving the information they need at the time that they need it. We want to design our signage and our layout so that our volunteer placement so that a guest never has to be confused about what happens next. Confusion leads to anxiety, and anxiety may mean that a guest is having such a freak out moment on the inside that they can't see what is transpiring all around them. When we talk about making outsiders insiders, we don't mean that you should unload every step of your process during a guest's first moment on site. That's akin to naming your kids on a first date. It's just not something that you do. No, you want to think through what they need to know and what will help them make small incremental steps forward. And finally, we believe that the first visit should set up the second visit. Church growth gurus almost universally agree that a guest will decide within the first 10 minutes whether or not they'll ever return to your church. And I would dare say that at most of our churches, you're not even getting into the auditorium in the first 10 minutes. Think about that. A guest hasn't heard preaching or worship, the two things that you've prepared for all week long, and yet they've already made up their mind on whether or not they're coming back. A few years ago, Gary McIntosh studied growing churches across America. His research revealed that in the typical growing church, there is a 16% chance that a first-time guest will return for a second visit. But for those who came back a second time, there was an 85% chance that they would return for a third visit. And when I read that statistic, it changed everything. It fundamentally changed the way that we looked at the first-time experience. The second visit means more exposure to the gospel. We know that it may be rare for someone to respond to the gospel the very first time that they hear it. The second visit means more opportunity for interaction. It means another chance to hear the mission and the vision of the church. It means another way for your guests to stick around. So it's not just the visit itself, but what you do after the visit that will set up a second trip. How are you following up in an appropriate yet non-stalkerish way? I'm excited about the potential for you to implement these 5 principles. And I hope that you have a better understanding of how the sermon really does start in the parking lot.